Good evening to all of those joining us from across the United States and around the world. Welcome to this, a live question and answer session concerning the Preble County Jane Doe, now known to most as Penny Doe. I'm Sean McCracken with MysteriousWV, and I will be your moderator this evening. Tonight, we will be answering your questions about Penny Doe's case and the current investigation, which is seeking to ascertain her true identity. Questions for tonight were submitted and chosen in advance, and we will be focusing early on, primarily on those questions. However, we will monitor the comments for new questions, but again, most of the questions will be chosen from those that have already been received. Joining us tonight to field your questions about Penny Doe are Anthony Redgrave of Redgrave Research, who specializes in DNA forensics and DNA genealogy, which is the general science of giving the names back to the unidentified. Also joining us tonight is Officer Adam Turner with the Shelby, Ohio Police Department. He is currently the officer in charge of the investigation into Penny's identity, as well as the missing persons case, which brought Penny's case back into the light. Gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I am very happy to have this opportunity to answer questions for our viewers.
Likewise, Sean, thank you for hosting this. I'm glad that we can all get together to do this.
My pleasure. As I said before, most of the questions being put to these gentlemen this evening were submitted in advance. Again, we will monitor the comments that are coming in and attempt to address any new questions if time permits. Also, we will not be answering questions related to my own involvement or the involvement of MysteriousWV in this case. If you have any questions concerning myself or the MysteriousWV channel, you can email them to me at mysteriouswv@gmail.com, and that email address should be available in the description for this particular video. Now then, Officer Turner, as you've been involved in this matter longer than any of us, I think it appropriate to put the first question to you, sir. And this is one of those short questions which will probably require a long answer, but with regards to Penny Doe, just how did we get to where we are this evening?
Well, yeah, you're right, Sean. It is going to be a lengthy answer, but to understand adequately how we arrived here, I have to first discuss the missing persons investigation that started, this whole process. So in October of 2018, my police chief, Lance Combs, was contacted via our departmental Facebook page by a woman by the name of Mindy Wilson. Mindy stated that her grandmother, Mary Jane Croft Van Gilder, was missing and had been since 1945. Mindy went on to state that her grandmother was originally from Fairmont, West Virginia, county of Marion, and she moved to North Central Ohio in 1944 to work at the Wilkins Army Air Force Depot. Now, the Wilkins Army Air Force Depot was essentially a warehouse that manufactured airplane parts and munitions during World War II. Mindy further stated that when her grandmother worked in Shelby, the county of Richland, she lived in two other addresses in Huron County, one in the village of Plymouth, which is north of Shelby, and the other in the city of Willard, which is northwest of Plymouth, about 7 miles away. So Chief Combs advised Mindy that he would see what he could find on her grandmother, and he checked all of our available police records, which unfortunately went back to the late 1960s, but was unable to find anything about Miss Van Gilder. He also spoke to several Shelby City police chiefs who preceded him, and they too had never heard of Miss Van Gilder. So Chief Combs then reached out to the Plymouth Police Chief, Tom Heinz, who reported that he was familiar with the case, and that in 2004, while he was a sergeant, he was contacted by Mindy's sister, Misty Griner, who also asked for police assistance with her grandmother's case. Chief Heinz conducted some research into the case, but ultimately was unable to uncover any records at his agency regarding Miss Van Gilder. Now, the Plymouth newspaper at the time ran a story about Mary Jane to see if it would maybe spark a memory in the community. And one gentleman by the name of William King, he responded to Misty and said that he, in fact, did remember her grandmother. He stated that when he was a boy, his father and his brother worked at the Wilkins Army Air Force Depot, and Mary Jane would get rides from his father to and from work because she didn't drive. He said that Mary Jane was very pretty and very polite, but he hadn't thought of her in decades. But the picture in the newspaper sparked his memory. And then ultimately, he couldn't recall much else. Now, the investigation into Mary Jane's disappearance actually started with her daughter Anna Mae Rager, in the 1940s. And she really has not given up the search for her mother since. In the late 1940s, Anna wrote several governmental entities asking if they knew about the whereabouts of her mother. Unfortunately, she always received generally the same response, that no trace of her mother was found. Chief Combs and I spoke about the inquiry from Mindy, and I agreed that I would take on the case. So how I started was in October and November of 2018. I obviously communicated a lot with the family to ingest as much information about the family that was already known. And then I started to search every available database that was available to me as a law enforcement officer to try to track Mary Jane's whereabouts past.
You found something, if I could interject, you found some interesting documentation at the FBI, did you not?
Yes. So thanks for bringing that up, Sean. So Anna Mae had told me that she wrote the FBI and that she actually received some responses stamped from the desk of J. Edgar Hoover. And like I had mentioned previously, that they were about the similar response, that they just could not find any records of Mary Jane. They were sorry that they couldn't get involved. It was more of a local police matter. I ended up doing a freedom of information request to the FBI because Anna Mae was not sure that she had all the documents. And I was able to eventually get a pretty large file considering the time period. And they contained all of Anna Mae's letters to the FBI, as well as the FBI's responses. And there was a picture in there that Anna Mae had sent of her mother that basically had kind of been lost to the sands of time. So
you got to see, I'm sorry again. So you got to see the other side of the correspondence.
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, that was very important. And it was neat to share that with Anna Mae, because she obviously hadn't seen those for decades. So I searched and I searched, but I could never find any documented trace of Mary Jane past 1945, when she abruptly quit her job at the Air Force Depot, citing added household duties. So I then, theorized that maybe, Mary Jane died as an unidentified person or a Jane Doe, and could be buried literally anywhere. And so I started by searching the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, known as NamUs, for Jane Does found around 1945, but there really were very few results. And those that were present, the physical characteristics or the circumstances around the body's discovery just could not match up to Mary Jane's. Initially, of course, I started my search in Ohio, since that's where she was last known to be. But when I was unable to find a Jane Doe that I thought could be her, I started to expand my search outward geographically to the surrounding states and eventually the whole nation. I did the same with the years of discovery. I started in 1945, and then I moved forward in time, but I also had the same results. There was nothing. There were no matches that could be her. Now, NamUs is a very fantastic tool for law enforcement, but it's only as good as the information that's put into it. So when I couldn't,
so if it's just to say, if it's bad data in, then it's going to be bad data out.
Right. Or if there's no data in, there's going to be no data coming out. So when I couldn't find a search in NamUs, I began searching the website Find a Grave. And by doing so, I came across an old article from 1968 from Preble County, Ohio, which is about 30 miles west of Dayton, where an unidentified body had been found by a group of children. And by reading the article, I noticed that there were physical characteristics of the Jane Doe, estimated at the time by the coroner, that were similar to Mary Jane's. The coroner said that he theorized it was a Caucasian female, 40 to 50 years of age, standing between 5'2" and 5'4".
40 to 50 years age at time of death?
Yes, that's correct. So this would obviously mean that Mary Jane had lived for several years after she left Richland County, and that she met her death in Preble County or the surrounding area later on. So a dental plate found near the remains was estimated by a dentist to be about 10 to 15 years old after 1950, which would put the date of death for the Jane Doe between the years of 1953 and 1958. Now, Mary Jane at the time would have fallen within that bracket. She would have been between 42 and 47 years of age. So I reached out to NamUs and I said, can you put me in contact with the coroner there, the coroner's investigator? And they put me in contact with Dave Linloff. Now, Dave, he was fortunately able to recover many of the original coroner's documents, and he provided them to me, and I in turn sent him my police report that I had written up to that point. And we decided that after looking at the documents, there was really no way to include or exclude Mary Jane from being this Jane Doe without exhuming the remains. So, I will say that Dave and the Preble County coroner Vossler were fantastic to work with. Instead of coming up with excuses as to why we shouldn't or couldn't exhume from the start, they worked together with me focusing on why we should exhume, which is ultimately because it's the right thing to do to identify an unknown person and give closure to that person's family. So I reached out to the original child that had found this Jane Doe, Brian McFall. And he remembered the incident very clearly. And he said that he was playing with a group of friends, and he basically discovered this Jane Doe in a drainage ditch behind his house. Now, Brian put me in touch with his neighbor, who was a local historian. And this neighbor had pictures and a plot map of the cemetery where this Jane Doe was buried. And that was in Mound Hill Cemetery in Eaton.
That was invaluable, was it to find not only the photos of the coffin, but the plat map of the burial location?
Absolutely, because when I took those documents and then gave them to cemetery officials, they did not have records from that Jane Doe's burial. So what they did is they looked at these two pictures that were taken in 1968, and they looked at the slope of the land and some background trees and estimated where this grave would be, because there was nothing marking at all where this Jane Doe was buried. So Dave and Coroner Vossler, who signed the order of exhumation in the city of Eaton, their maintenance department, their police department, they all worked together, and they all paved the way for this exhumation to take place. And they didn't put any unnecessary roadblocks or bureaucratic red tape in my way. So in August of 2019, Chief Combs and I traveled to Eaton for the exhumation. Dave and Counter Vossler and county and city administration was present. The grave was dug. Very quickly after, we located the original vault, and the vault was subsequently lifted by its original handles. And we saw the inside of this vault that hadn't been opened since 1968. Now, the original pauper's casket that this Jane Doe was buried in had deteriorated, and it was gone, besides its metal handles. But the body bag that this Jane Doe was buried in was still there. It had obviously deteriorated significantly, but you could still see the fabric and the plastic of the body bag, and it kind of wrapped around the skeleton, kind of preserving it a little more. So agents from the Ohio BCI came out, and they ended up removing the Jane Doe from the vault, and they subsequently took 2 femurs of the Jane Doe's and multiple digits, the hands and feet. And that was done for DNA testing. So I waited at the end of 2019 and then the beginning of 2020, and then COVID hit and everything kind of shut down. So it wasn't until the beginning of 2021 that I received a notification that they tested the Jane Doe's remains, and that while a very partial DNA profile was obtained, there were no hits in Codis, which is the national DNA system. Now, from the beginning, I knew this was possible because obviously DNA breaks down over time, depending on a variety of factors. But once I received a notification that there was not a hit in the DNA system, or that there was not enough suitable to yield a comparison, I knew, from the start that I wanted Anthony Redgrave and Redgrave Research to do the forensic genealogy testing.
And on that note, Anthony Redgrave and Redgrave Research are assisting in the investigation as of now. Anthony, good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
Okay. For those of us who are laymen and might not be aware, what exactly are DNA forensics and DNA genealogy, and how do they apply to this particular Jane Doe?
Certainly. So forensic genetic genealogy is the process of applying what we know from traditional genealogy methods and genetic genealogy, which is when people take a DNA test and they send it off to get processed and get back their list of cousins, taking those basic principles of how to identify the relationships between people who share genetic material and applying that to a law enforcement case. So the forensic part of it just means anything with a legal bearing. And in this instance, we're primarily dealing with unidentified decedents or perpetrators of violent crimes. So it's the way that it plays in with this particular case is that since the STR profile, the short tandem repeat profile that was developed for comparison in Codis was somewhat inconclusive, the next step would be do whole genome sequencing. Now, the process of processing DNA for comparison in Codis is very different from what we do because they're looking at approximately 20 to 30 different specific markers in a person's genetic profile, whereas we are looking at thousands upon thousands, and it matters how many in a row are the same rather than how many individual spots are exactly the same. So that gives us a lot more information to work with, and we can compare people and estimate whether they're not only full siblings or parent and child, but also go back as far as fifth or sixth cousins. And then we use the paper trail available through genealogical records like census data and vital records from different states and immigration papers and everything to build out the trees of those matches, find out where their common ancestors are, and assume that if there are two people who we know where they came from and an unidentified person who shares genetic material with them, that we can trace down from that common ancestor who the two known people share and find where the unidentified person is. Now, we do this several times over in sort of like a giant logic puzzle. So in the instance where we have this unidentified woman who her DNA was processed for Codis comparison, but there was only a partial profile created, the next step would be to go to whole genome sequencing, which gathers the entire picture of a person's genetic makeup and not just those couple of spots. So those places that they were looking for to compare for one-to-one direct comparison, they might be missing in that sequence. That data might have degraded and might have just fallen off. What we can do is we can get what is there, even if it's in those, not those specific spots, and use what we have to use genealogical research methods to infer who this person actually is related to her probably distant cousins. So even if the STR data was inconclusive, even if Preble County Penny turns out to actually be Mary Jane Van Gilder, there is a strong likelihood that we will be able to use our methodology to prove or disprove that pretty quickly. And if she is not, then we will have enough data to move forward and find out who she actually is.
So if she is Mary Jane Van Gilder, we solved 2 cases. If not, we still have two cases open. Is that correct?
Yes,
All
but we will
right.
solve one.
Okay, that brings us into the first of the questions, which were submitted ahead of time. This question is addressed to Detective Turner, but I think it might apply equally as well to each of you gentlemen. From Jamie, the question, have you done any familial DNA research? And I'm assuming she means on Penny.
Well, I could first say personally, I have. I've submitted my DNA through Ancestry.com, and it was uploaded into GEDmatch. Now, my brother has done a lot more with our ancestry, but I know basically where I come from and how I got here. Professionally, I've taken a course that Anthony has put on, and I'm one of his beta group interns.
Anthony, can you add anything to that?
Yes. So just to clarify, many people are using familial searching in interchangeably with forensic genetic genealogy. And while I know that the person who submitted this question probably meant forensic genetic genealogy, the main difference is that familial searching is a method that actually predates what we do and actually uses the Codis system. So it uses partial DNA matches to infer a relationship between people that would not qualify as a conclusive match as, one-to-one. This person is a full sibling, parent or child, or the same person as the person we're trying to ID. And that uses STR data and also Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA if it's available. There are many states in the country that actually don't allow the use of this particular method because the probability data associated with it isn't conclusive enough to lead to an ID. You can use this to get closer to a tip, and that's what people were doing before. What we do is different. And that is what I teach through our course, FG4LE, Forensic Genealogy Training for Law Enforcement. It's not just for law enforcement, people who are in other forensics fields or who are forensics adjacent, or people who are genealogists and want to learn how to apply this to forensic work can also apply to this course. So it's important to note that these are two different things, and I'm highly interested in being able to differentiate them because, as I said, there are some places in this country where it is illegal to do familial searching because it is not considered, the probability is not considered conclusive enough. But in those same states, they may allow forensic genealogy to be done because that will lead to something that can be used for a conclusive identification.
So is this another thing that is dependent upon how large the database is that you have to work with going in?
Yes, somewhat. One important thing to note is that the likelihood of identifying an unidentified decedent using the Codis system is less than 1%. And that is because the Codis database is mostly populated by perpetrators of violent crimes who have been apprehended and have their DNA put into the system, or perpetrators of violent crimes who have not yet been apprehended and have had their data entered into the system to be compared to people who were apprehended. So it's, and they don't compare those to perpetrators. So if for some reason an unidentified decedent also happens to be a perpetrator of violent crime, those aren't necessarily compared automatically. You might have to ask to have that done and possibly even jump through some legal loopholes to get it done. So we are a more holistic approach to this problem. And in doing so, we're actually revealing a number of shortcomings of the current system that I really hope we can actually help improve upon to make human identification of all kinds much faster and much more efficient and much more conclusive. So that's that. Hopefully that answers a little bit of your question about the database issue. With forensic genetic genealogy, we're using GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. And those are the only two DNA databases for genealogical use that are permitted for the use for forensic cases. Most other sites, Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage, all have it specifically laid out in their terms of service that they do not allow their databases to be used for law enforcement purposes. And that's fine. They're trying to protect the privacy of their users who can download their raw data and upload them to those two other sites so that we can compare them, so it's fine. That being said, we don't have a huge database, but we have enough to work with for most cases and know how to seek out people to add to that database if we need more data. It's a very different way of doing things than has been done before and involves a lot more investigative methodology as well as forensic science. So it's sort of a hybrid field. It's not a straight shot, this person is the same person, we're done. It can take anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of months to solve a case, but it still gets the job done.
Okay, back to the crime scene, as it were. Our next question, you might not know it, but Penny Doe's remains were essentially found in somebody's backyard. And the next question from our viewers is, what is the possibility that the body was from a private cemetery? Now, the question is addressed to each of you. Detective Turner, if you would like to address that first.
Of course, that is a possibility. And we really won't know until Penny is identified. But I personally don't think that's the case. And Sean, you have actually done more research than I have to kind of back up my opinion.
Yes, I checked the maps of the area, and by maps I mean the geographical survey maps that are prepared by the government. They're about as detailed as you can get, and they also do list cemeteries that are family cemeteries. And there were the only cemetery in the general vicinity or within 5 or 10 miles that I could see of where the remains were found was Mound Hill, where Penny was eventually buried. So if that was the case, I could not find any evidence of it. Anthony, what's your take on that?
My take on that, Sean, is basically the same thing that you just said, is that if the geographic topographical maps that are provided, by the government do not say that there are private family cemeteries, or indicate that there were any graves that were dislodged from Mound Hill, I would say that she was not previously conventionally interred somewhere else, unless there was an undocumented family cemetery, which I guess is somewhat possible, but these things are very carefully recorded. That being said, I would lean more towards the idea of her being a clandestine burial, meaning someone who was buried secretly because they were trying to dispose of a body. That's my theory. But there still remains the possibility, a very slim possibility, that she was interred conventionally. But if there's nothing on maps to indicate that there was a cemetery anywhere nearby that she could have washed out from, then I would say that that theory can pretty easily be put to rest at this point, and it shouldn't be too much of a concern.
There was some speculation early on, and by early on I mean 1968, that the body might have been embalmed. It's my understanding that that has now been pretty well discounted. Is that correct?
And you want to take this?
Yeah, I'll start. So that was mentioned one time in the coroner's report. It was never mentioned again. And Dave Linloff actually knew the coroner's investigator, Tim Miller, who initially started the case, and that was never mentioned at all. I do not think that the body was embalmed. Is it possible? Yeah, absolutely, sure, anything's possible, but I think that it's a very slim possibility.
All right.
I can add a little bit to that. So given some other cases that I've worked on, including the Bell and the Well and also Clark County John Doe, they were both in states of adipocere, which is not something that is very well understood by most people, and also can definitely mess with the postmortem interval estimate. So my assumption is that that might have been misconstrued by the original coroner, because not many people really know what to do with that, with good reason, because there have been instances where an adipocere state body has been found, a person has ruled that they were dead for like a matter of a couple of years, and then it turned out that they were from the Civil War era, and the reason why they were adipocere is because they were underneath a lot of other bodies, they stayed preserved. So my guess is that if the adipocere state led to that assumption, and therefore that assumption is probably not correct, and I think we can also put that to that.
Very broadly speaking, by adipocere, we mean that there is a certain amount of skin and muscle intact, which I understand was the case with Penny. There was the skin and muscle intact on the underside, or the posterior side of the body. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you think that that might have kind of given people the idea that she might have been more recently deceased than is now believed?
Yeah, that's something that I've seen happen before. In my experience, that is something that I have seen lead to a somewhat inaccurate or not easily estimable postmortem interval, and it just has to do with the state that the remains were preserved in, and there's a lot of factors there. So that's that's what
That's a very scientific aspect there. So I think we're going to go on to our next question here. Officer Turner, this is addressed to you. The question is, with Ohio somewhat centrally located in the United States, do you find that it has an above average number of unclaimed or unidentified deceased individuals?
So in NamUs right now, there are 102 unknowns in the state of Ohio. Now, the true number of unknowns in Ohio is going to be far greater than that because many are just not entered into NamUs. Many have been forgotten about with people not keeping records and records being destroyed. And essentially that person, unfortunately, has been forgotten. I think that the size of the state, population-wise, does correlate to the number of unknowns. So, like California, for example, has 2,774 unknowns. But just back to Ohio, obviously 102 is way too many, and we're going to do everything we can to reduce those numbers. And I can say that, since taking on this case and since Mary Jane Van Gilder's case has been publicized, as well as Penny's case has been publicized, which is I have been very thankful for. The media has really helped push both cases out there. I've been contacted by multiple law enforcement agencies throughout Ohio who read the article and have kind of been motivated, saying, hey, we have this unknown and we'd like to do the same thing. Tell me about what you do. So the law enforcement agencies in Ohio that I've talked to are very progressive in the terms of, yes, we need to do exhumations to give these people their name back. And I would like Ohio, obviously it's my home state, to kind of be a role model across the country for other states to do the same.
Once the ball starts rolling, we want to keep it going, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Anthony, the next question, sir, is addressed to you. But again, Officer Turner, if you would like to address this one, I think it might be appropriate as well. The question, is it possible for pathology to rule undetermined or unexplained in a toxicology report only to later discover foul play?
I would say yes. If something is inconclusive, then you obviously need to conclude that later. Toxicology report can only tell you so much. And I think that also we might be also talking about medical examiner's evaluation of cause and manner of death, which can sometimes, very often, be found to be inconclusive. But in the case of Penny, it is not outside of the realm of possibility that she was a homicide. And that is because of the possibility of her being clandestine burial and there being no record of her being washed up from any cemeteries. So how did she get there? People don't just leave bodies in places if they died of natural causes unless there's a reason for that. So that's just my opinion on that. But as far as cause and manner of death being, yes, exactly. Science always improves. And if there was a further anthropological look at her remains, maybe we might find another thing to look at. But without the skull, which we still don't have, you can only get so much. And there's also the records that are available on this case have told us quite a bit, and there was actually quite a thorough look at her remains at the time, but science has advanced so much that maybe there should be another look at it. But generally, there can't be a homicide investigation without knowing who the victim is. So until we know who Penny is, it will be very hard to know what happened to her and how she ended up there.
So saying two experts looking at the same set of facts, it's not unusual for them to maybe arrive at different conclusions?
Absolutely. And also, there's been a matter of decades in between the last medical examiner's report, and the science has greatly advanced since then. So there might be things that might have been cutting edge at the time when she was examined that are now considered to be proven to be ineffective methods of evaluating remains, and it might be a good idea to take another look at her. So that is something to consider, a possibility if we are in need of doing that, depending on how things go when we get to the genealogy part.
Officer Turner, this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also pertinent, I believe. Do law enforcement and the medical examiner's office always agree?
No, no, they don't. And, we have to struggle with that. Obviously, communication is key, but, we're trained differently. Law enforcement is trained to basically, this is the way it should be. When you arrive at a crime scene, you always investigate it as a homicide until you can prove otherwise. There have been many instances where law enforcement arrive on the scene and it's suspicious, but they instantly rule it suicide, and it comes back later on that no, it was in fact homicide. And at that point, evidence has been lost, and the case is kind of tainted at that point. So law enforcement might think the case is suicide or homicide, but really the coroner or the medical examiner, they are medically trained, they are doctors, and they know a lot more than we know in regards to wounds and the cause and manner of death. So generally, yes, we get along in most jurisdictions, but yeah, there's disagreement that arises.
All right. Anthony, the next question is addressed to you, sir. I think you might have already touched on this, but just in case, which genealogy company do you most rely on?
Us. just to be like completely frank about it. Depending on what you mean by genealogy company, with forensic genetic genealogy, there's a lot of factors. We have several different labs that we work with for different stages of the lab process. We haven't currently decided on where we're sending Penny for the extraction phase, which is the actual act of getting the liquid DNA extract out of solid physical remains, like her bones. We're going to have to send her somewhere. I have a couple of good ideas, and honestly, so many places keep making leaps and bounds in their advances that we have to keep an eye out for who's doing what thing and take a chance on trying new stuff sometimes. So
Make sure the right hand knows what the left hand is doing.
Yes, there's a lot of communication and a lot of collaboration that goes into our work. So one thing that we really stress as a group is the importance of keeping everyone involved really in the loop. So we like to keep an open communication with the law enforcement agency, and we like to make sure that they know exactly what we're doing every step of the way as much as possible. Now, we have a responsibility as the genealogists to protect the identities of living people who are DNA matches to the person we're trying to ID, unless it becomes necessary to actually reach out to them for some reason. But we have made a promise to protect that information as much as possible. So pretty much everything except for the names of living people will communicate with agencies that are involved until and unless it becomes essential to do that. And that usually happens when we're getting close to an ID and we find somebody who may be next of kin. So this maybe is going a little bit off base of what the question actually was, but as far as what genealogy companies do we most rely on, we currently have a pretty good working relationship with Hudson Alpha for whole genome sequencing, and that's where we're we're going to be sending her for sequencing when we decide where we're sending her for extraction. And then when it comes to the actual genealogy aspect of it, we right off the bat will be uploading to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA and using all the available resources at both of those locations with our team of very highly trained genealogists and interns to actually reach the idea.
Well, with regards to personal information, I don't think we could have segued that any better had we planned it. Officer Turner, the next question is for you, sir. Going back to Mary Jane Van Gilder. For people who don't know, when we updated Mary Jane Van Gilder's case last year, we took the unusual step of releasing her Social Security number. Has there been any update on Mary Jane's Social Security number? Any activity?
No, is the short answer. At the moment, I'm really struggling to find any documentation conclusively proving her existence past that final date in 1945. Now, that does not rule out the possibility that she changed her name or documents to live under another name. When I think of two recent cases of that happening, and Anthony, you might be able to expound on this a little bit, but the case of Lori Erica Ruff and Joseph Newton Chandler are two examples of situations where that has happened in recent years, where someone has taken the identity of someone else for a variety of reasons, and they haven't been found out, or it's been a mystery for several years.
All right. And dovetailing right along with that, the next question, Officer Turner, is also for you. Do you believe there is a strong likelihood that Penny Doe is Mary Jane Van Gilder?
I mean, percentage-wise, no. I don't think that the chances are high. I think if I said anything different, I wouldn't be being honest. But even if the possibility is less than one, that should not be an excuse to not try. To try to do absolutely everything possible to include exhumations to give that person their true name back. Now, I'm optimistic, but I'm also realistic at the same time. But I've said from the very beginning, and Chief Combs has agreed with me, that whoever Penny was, regardless if it was Mary Jane or not, she needed a name, and we're going to identify her. We're going to see it till the end.
All righty. Anthony, the next question is for you, and it follows again right in that same vein. What does it mean that previous testing was inconclusive as to a link between Penny Doe and Mary Jane?
What that means is that the DNA that was extracted and sequenced from her remains originally by BCI was found to not contain enough data to conclusively one-to-one compare her to Mary Jane or her children. So that means that when they did the DNA sequence, there were some parts missing because of degradation, because of over the years, DNA degrades, and the parts that they needed to look at just weren't there. So they didn't have the data to compare, so they couldn't make that comparison.
In that vein, if I could interject just real quick, I think it's known by now fairly well that when Penny Doe was exhumed, one of the items that was conspicuously missing was the skull. From a DNA standpoint, is that a setback?
It is somewhat of a setback because one of the best sources of DNA for forensic genetic genealogy for whole genome sequencing is actually the teeth. If there's a tooth without a filling that still has its inner core preserved, you can use that, and it's one of the best sources of DNA for extraction if all you have is bone remains. Barring that, you move down to any weight-bearing bones, like long bones, like the femur, and next to that, you would go to the bones of the feet. And anything that's going to be dense, that's going to hold a lot of like solid material, that's what you want to use. And we always hope that there's teeth. Like that's going to be your best shot for getting something usable. And in this case, there wasn't. And also a major setback of not having the skull is I personally also do forensic reconstruction art at the same time. And that has been absolutely invaluable in the process of identification through forensic genetic genealogy, because people's facial characteristics, they carry across generations, and you can see parts of yourself in your cousins, and you can know when you're getting close to a family group when people start looking. And it's not enough on its own to prove an identification. Although sometimes there have been instances where a good piece of forensic art has actually led to an identification because somebody recognized them, and that's amazing, and I love seeing that. But barring that happening, which I always hope that it does, because we should be the closers, we shouldn't be the one doing all the work right off the bat. We should give everything else a try first, because this is time consuming and expensive. It's getting less expensive and we're getting better at it, so it's less time consuming, but it takes a while. Everything else should get tried first. So not having the skull and not being able to do a forensic image does actually give us a little bit of a setback, because we won't be able to make those facial comparisons across family groups and do the warmer, colder thing we do with that when we have it.
Getting away from our viewers' questions for just a second, with regards to the investigation into Penny's identity, the dental plate is missing. Her seventh rib is missing. All of the photographs are missing, but the skull being missing, why would the skull be missing, and where could it possibly be?
I'll let Adam take care of that one.
So when we were reviewing, obviously when we opened that vault and there was not a skull in there, it was quite a surprise to us. But when we were reviewing back through the coroner's documents, there was a notation in there that said the skull was kept in the private collection of Tim Miller. Now, does that mean he took it to his house? Maybe, but it also could mean that he held on to it in the hopes that maybe he foresaw some technology down the road where they could do some photo superimposition with a skull to see if they matched up. Or it was donated by Tim Miller or by the person that took the job after him, that it was donated to a university or a college for the purposes of training for medical students.
I remember during the exhumation, immediately when it was discovered that there was no skull, without missing a beat, one of the members of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation immediately said, it's probably on a desk somewhere. So
yeah, and you know what?
Is that the working theory?
Yes, it is. And unfortunately, I'm sure there are people listening that are like, oh my God, how could all these files be missing? And how can all these photographs be missing and evidence? And you know what? It happens. And
They've never worked in a bureaucracy before, have they?
Exactly. And, unfortunately, it's bad practice. It makes law enforcement look bad, but, I can't make excuses for what happened decades prior, but that stuff does happen and it's commonplace. And that's why, especially in the older cases, that's why there are so many unidentified bodies underground that we don't even know are there. And that's where a lot of these missing people are. They're buried in a cemetery with no marker. And there's really no record that they existed unless, somebody has kept like a cemetery plot or somebody has a memory of a Jane or John Doe being buried there.
I don't want this to be interpreted as a gotcha question, but I was going through the coroner's report the other night, and there were several missing persons cited from 1968, and I did a little cursory checking, and only one of them out of about 5 has been found. Did you ever have a chance to follow up on any of the other missing persons who were named in that report?
So I believe the missing person you're referring to is Elizabeth Ernstine.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay. So yes, I looked up each one of those missing people and saw that they were still missing. But then like I'll look at their name as profile and there's nothing there. I mean, besides some very basic information. And how sad is that there's absolutely nothing there. So, you know, the positives of this case and this investigation is Penny might not be Mary Jane, but it's somebody, and it might be somebody that's already a missing person. But in 1968, they just didn't know or have the technology to know about DNA.
I'm stepping out of my role as a moderator here and actually being a reporter. So other than Mary Ernstine, the other individuals in that case file, as far as we know, are still missing?
Well, some now that you say that, some were found, but they were never noted in the report that they were found.
Okay.
So like, and I found that out by I would search them and they wouldn't pop up in NamUs, and then I'd go to find their grave and they had since, you know, passed away. So and their real name was on their headstone. So yeah, I think I can't remember all of them that were listed in that file besides Elizabeth Ernstine. I think most of them had been ruled out. There might have been 1 or 2 that are still missing.
File that for later. We'll talk about that down the road sometime. Anthony, I haven't forgotten about you. So the next viewer question is for you, sir.
Okay.
Let me make sure that I get this correct. Does enough DNA exist for Penny so that you might be able to submit it to, and I believe this is important, Ancestry.com or 23andMe?
Okay, so I can clarify that. So yes, DNA exists because we have most of her skeleton. What we're doing right now is actually we have a fundraiser in place for the lab fees that will make it possible to actually extract the DNA from her skeleton and get it through the lab process so we can actually do the genealogy part of it. Now, I mentioned it earlier and I'll mention it again. Ancestry and 23andMe and MyHeritage all have specific language in their terms of service that forbid the use of their service for law enforcement purposes. That is because they choose to protect the privacy of their consumers, and that's completely reasonable. They have the right to do that. They've made a commitment to the people who are accessing their services. And if someone from one of those services wants to download their raw data and upload it to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA and opt into law enforcement matching, then we will be able to see if those people who do that are.
That would be up to the individual
Yes.
Subscriber.
Absolutely. So okay. The database itself is not allowed to be used for law enforcement. Like a law enforcement kit would not be able to be uploaded to either of those services. Those 2 sites actually don't accept individual uploads anyway. They're 2 of the databases that you have to purchase a kit in order to be in their database. MyHeritage, 23andMe, and GEDmatch, you can upload data from other places. MyHeritage, however, specifically has a little checkbox when you upload your data that says, I'm not using this for law enforcement purposes. So don't do that. So that being said,
makes your job a lot easier, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we hope that people are following those rules. Most of the people I know do, so that's good. And it's important to maintain those standards and follow those rules, because if something is done out of turn, it could actually negatively impact the investigation. If it's found that information pertaining to a case was obtained through illicit means or illegal means by defying a terms of service that's clearly laid out, and you say, I agree to it, then you could be endangering the case you're working on. So we don't do that.
Fruit of the poisonous tree.
Yes, exactly. So that means, we have less data to work with, but we still have plenty to work with. So roundabout way of answering that question, yes, there is DNA available. We just have to extract it from her skeleton. And therefore we have a fundraiser for the lab costs right at the moment, because the department does not have budget to allocate to that, because this is a new science and people haven't budgeted for that yet. And so by showing the proof in the pudding, eventually maybe there will be budget toward that in many jurisdictions, but right at the moment there's not. So we're fundraising for it to show proof of concept.
This question coming completely from myself, just to illustrate what you were talking about. Is it true that under the current criteria that the bell in the well would not have been identified?
I think she would have been identified eventually. It just would have taken longer.
Eventually can mean 1 year, 2 years, or a century.
Yes. It did take us 14 months to identify her. And really, it could have gone on for a lot longer if there hadn't been that one person who got a DNA kit for Christmas and uploaded it to show us the other side of her family that was missing, because there was an underrepresented population within her family tree, and we were able to fill that gap in when all of a sudden that one person uploaded. So let this be my public service announcement for a moment. Anybody who's watching, if you're not uploaded to Family Tree DNA or GEDmatch, or if you haven't done a DNA test yet, and you come from recent immigrants or a population that doesn't test much, please do that if you're interested in helping get those identified, because you could be the person who leads to that ID. And maybe you'll never know that, but you must know that you could really help us, and really, you never know.
Officer Turner, the next question to you, sir, and I particularly like this one because this is obviously very positive. How will you feel when Penny's case is solved, and what goes from there?
I'll be elated when that day comes, and it will come. I'm going to be very happy and satisfied that my investigation kind of kicked this whole thing off, and that we did the right thing. From there, I'd like to replicate the process that we used in Eaton, because of the collaboration between agencies, we streamlined the process, and there was no legalese, there were no roadblocks, there were no hurdles at all. We worked together as two communities, two agencies, to do the right thing and get it done. And I'm hoping that this case maybe will motivate a police department, a citizen, coroner's office to say, hey, I remember a case from when I was growing up, or hey, we have this unidentified Jane and John Doe. Maybe we should take another look at it now that the technology is there.
Now that the technology is there, modern technology, to what extent does that factor in to how these cases are now being solved? And not just from a DNA standpoint, from things like the word scanning of newspapers and documents, where searching a newspaper would have taken months and months in the past, can now be searched in a matter of seconds. How big a factor is that?
That's huge. I mean, look at what we're doing right now.
There were some articles on this that we would have never known existed, were there?
Exactly. And as far as, our collaboration, Sean, that's kind of how, we found each other basically through Anthony and the Bell in the Well case. So your work and Anthony's work you're the glue that's holding this all together. But as far as libraries, you used to have to go down to the basement and look at microfiche to see, go through line by line to find what you're looking for now, if you subscribe to newspapers.com, and that newspaper organization has uploaded old newspapers to that website, it's very easily accessible, and it makes these cases, it makes cold cases so much easier, because with the click of a mouse, with the one stroke, you can find information that would have taken days, weeks, months, or you might not ever find it at all in the past.
And would have been a great strain on your eyes in the process.
That's right.
Okay. The last question that was submitted ahead of time, Officer Turner, it's actually addressed to you, but I'm going to put it to both of you because I think you each had some input on this. Where exactly did the name Penny come from?
That's an Anthony question.
Anthony will answer this question. Okay, so as a forensic genetic genealogist, when we get cases that come to us, they will usually come with county name, Jane Doe, year, and that's kind of a mouthful and not very personal. So we've gotten into the habit of using nicknames for cases. We'll give them a temporary name while we try to find their name. And in this case, I came to Adam and I said, hey, we like to do this nicknaming process. And usually it's just an internal thing. And if the agency likes it, we'll use it, because it does help make everything feel more real and more individual. And like, this is a human being who needs to be recognized. So what I talked to Adam about was, typically, standard practice, we'd just use like something alliterative with the first letter of the county they were found in or something like that. And, just fired off a couple of suggestions, and Penny was the one that stuck, and we all just latched onto it and decided that was what we were going to use. It wasn't just going to be our internal name, that we'd stick with it. It's much nicer than Miss Ditch 68. I'll tell you that. I like that much better.
Yeah. That is a significant improvement, I think. Yes.
Yeah. And, going off what Anthony said, and I actually hope Anthony can answer this question. Can you kind of talk about the Buckskin Girl case and the Bell in the Well, and the differences in the investigations, why one took longer than the others? In both cases, we're in Ohio. So can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah. Okay. So, what? Yeah. So, the Buckskin Girl and Bell in the Well were both projects that we worked on when we were with the DNA Dope project before we broke off to form our own company. But what I can say as someone who worked on both of those cases and as the team leader of the Bell in the Well case, the reason why one took significantly less time than the other was actually because Buckskin Girl Marcia's father had actually built a family tree for her and put her in there as missing, presumed deceased. And that was actually found by the team working on her case. So let it be known that if you have a missing family member, maybe what you need to do is build their tree and make it public on Ancestry. We do look at that. We do find those while we're working, and that does help us. So we actually do give missing person support through our company as well. So if you are the family member of a missing person, you can actually reach out to us and we'll help you know what steps you need to take care of to have the best chance of getting your loved one found if they happen to have been found in another place as an unidentified decedent. So that's what happened with Marcia. With the Bell in the Well, we had a very limited DNA profile to begin with because her DNA was very degraded. She'd been submerged in a cistern for, honestly, we still don't know how long, and we still don't know who did it. And so there were large pieces missing, and also some of her family came from an underrepresented population. Her father was the child of a recent immigrant to Canada who then came to West Virginia. So it was a more complicated puzzle in a number of ways. It was the DNA being degraded and not having all of the data to work with and having to make some inferences, because we work in probabilities. there's a probability associated with the actual relationship of a person as compared to the amount of DNA they share. And then we corroborate that based on a paper trail. But when there's pieces missing, you don't have quite as sure of a probability. So that was a factor. We had the factor of a very large portion of her family being not represented in the databases we were working in. And we also had not really great PMI because, again, submerged in water for God knows how long and in an adipocere state. So, and endogamy. So endogamy is the practice of intermarriage between small cultures. It can be a small geographic location or a religious population or ethnic group. And what that means is if you're in a small community, you only have so many options of who you can marry. And eventually you're going to end up marrying somebody who's a cousin. And that happens all over the world. And it's actually perfectly normal. And we're not going to make fun of it because honestly, it happens a lot. It happens in every case we ever work on, and it's okay. But in this instance, it had happened for a number of times over many generations because she was from an isolated population in the Appalachians, like my family is, and I know what that looks like. So, it was pretty commonplace for me, but still not an easy puzzle. So all those factors together was what made her case take 14 months versus 8 hours for Buckskin Girl? Was she 4 hours? I think she took 4 hours to solve because her dad had that in his tree, and there were better matches to begin with because she was not from recent immigrants. And there's a number of factors. Like we've had a case take 3 days, we've had a case take a couple of hours, we've had a case take 18 months. And you really don't know what you're going to get until you get that DNA kit. And sometimes when you get that DNA kit, you still don't know what you're looking at for a little while. So it's just, you're kind of shooting blind until you get a handle on it. And you just keep working until you figure it out.
So I just kind of want to add something to what you said. How oftentimes recently that an unidentified person has been matched, we go back and they say, well, that person was never reported missing at all. And what I want to put out there to people that have family members that you don't know where they are and that could be missing, you need to make reports with your local law enforcement agency and to get their profile and to name us.
Yes, I will add to that. There is no standardized method of reporting a missing person as missing, especially if they are an adult. Some people, you can't look ill on a family that has an unidentified person get identified and they go, oh, that person was never reported missing. A lot of the times they did try to report that person missing and they actually thought that they had, but they were not properly entered into the system and there was no follow-up done. So family members of missing people should know that if you want to make sure that your case is taken seriously and is continuing to be worked on, take Mary Jane's family as an example. They continued to persevere and they reached out to the local department and they got Adam's help. There's got to be more than one Adam out there. Even though Adam is an example to be followed, there's going to be others like him out there. And if you are the family member of a missing person, please get in touch with your local law enforcement agency and make sure that your missing person's case is being taken seriously.
No data in, no data out. Mm-hmm. The Buckskin Doe and the Bell in the Well, both found in 1981 and both found in Ohio. Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, I am once again going to step outside of my normal role here as a moderator, and I'm going to step into the role as director. We are now an hour and 15 minutes into our session, and we have just completed all of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. We have quite a few that have come in the meantime. Would you gentlemen like to continue, or shall we wrap it up?
I'm fine with continuing if you are, Adam.
Yeah, let's go.
All right, very good. I'm particularly happy because I love this next question. I'm not sure who it's addressed to, so I'll throw it out to both of you. Quite simply, what happened to all of the files concerning Penny Doe's remains?
So the files that we do have came from the coroner's office, and Dave Lindloff was able to locate those. The files, the police reports that were originally made, who knows what happened to them? Lost to time, lost to someone saying, we don't need these records anymore, we're never going to solve this, purging them after a certain amount of time. All terrible practices, but it unfortunately happens. And I'd love it if some of those reports turned up somewhere. But as of right now, they are just gone, missing.
Anthony, would you like to address that?
Yes, so I can speak from experience that you tend to find a lot by going through the coroner medical examiner's office. They tend to have things there that will get lost in other places. And that's because they're the ones who are the custodians of the physical remains. They handle physical things a lot more often. The unfortunate reality of it is that there are so many cold cases in the country that, and there's only so much storage space, or there was before things could go digital, that there are a number of important files that have been lost or damaged or discarded because people didn't know what they were. There's been changes to indexing systems, and maybe something wasn't converted over all the way. And it's the unfortunate reality of a ever-changing and hopefully improving system of dealing with cold cases, which should still be taken seriously. Time does not lessen the importance of the life of a person being taken.
Here we're talking about files from 1968. Officer Turner, in Mary Jane Van Gilder's case, there were some other files that were thought lost forever from slightly before that turned up to actually still be in existence. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so you're going to have to help me on some dates here. But we knew that Mary Jane was a civilian employee during World War II, and her military file was always in question. Did it survive? And then we kind of theorized that it had been destroyed in the archive fire. Sean, what year was that? Do you remember?
1973 was the fire in St. Louis that is the cop-out for a lot of searchers.
Right. So what we initially thought that they were gone in that fire, and a lot of military files were destroyed in that fire, unfortunately. But the civilian files, and this came from somebody who reached out to me, said, hey, the civilian files were kept elsewhere. They were not in that building. They would not have been burned. They could be in existence. And they were. That person put me in touch with the right individual, and I reached out, and Mary Jane's complete military file was found.
The end result was 76 pages of invaluable information, was it not?
Yes, absolutely. And specifically the social, because we did not know that before. And the family had been searching for that social for decades. And initially, we didn't even know if she had a social security number. But looking at those military files, there it was. So absolutely invaluable. And any piece of document, somebody might say, well, that's not important or that's immaterial. In cold cases, in homicides, every piece of material, every document, every fact, every rumor, statements, it's all important. It all needs documented, because you're not going to solve a case without exceptionally thorough documentation and research.
And that's a 75-year-old case. And with regards to Penny, we're now talking about only a 53-year-old case. So if it can survive from World War II, can it survive from 1968?
Yeah, it can, and maybe it's out there. But speaking from experience with my own police department, my police department was originally located next to a creek, a river that flooded often. And when those waters rose, it entered the police department. So a lot of the older files were lost, and the original police department that was next to the river was torn down in 2007 because of flood damage, and we moved several times before our new building was constructed. But our case is not the only one. Other natural disasters, circumstances happen that caused files to be destroyed or lost over time.
History is replete with the story of the quote unquote burnt courthouse. So, Anthony, the next question is for you, sir. What does a forensic genealogist do, and how does that help a cold case?
Okay, this is one of my most favorite questions to answer, and is why I have an entire online training course to address this. fgforla.com, just dropping that in there. But my answer expands to be space provided. So basically what a forensic genetic genealogist does is we guide law enforcement agencies through the lab processes necessary to create a autosomal DNA profile similar to what is used for genealogy research by people who want to know where their families came from, or people who are adopted and want to identify their biological parents. And we use that same data in the same basic manner, but with the added difficulty of not knowing where that person was born, who they were raised by, and non-identifying information like you can sometimes acquire with an adoption case. And that is the point at which we work in conjunction with anthropologists who are sort of like, they fill in that gap for us by giving us a estimation of who that person might have been, how old they were, and when they died. So we can make a rough guess of when they might have been born and when they might have died, and therefore are able to look for proof of life after that date. And given all that data and the genealogical DNA file, which we upload to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, we use basically the same techniques as when a person is adopted and wants to find their birth parents, except we need to not only find their birth parents, we need to find them. Same game on hard mode, with the added bonus of doing our best to not have to actually contact any of those DNA matches, because it's an open law enforcement investigation, and we want to keep as much played close to our chest as possible. So we work in conjunction with coroner medical examiner's office, the investigating agency, anthropologists, and eventually and occasionally working with individual DNA testers or potential target testers of people who we might find in the process of doing this research and say, can we get data from you if you're willing to give it? And all those pieces working together, we do our best to make as close to an idea as possible of a person who best fits the description in what we have of the person we're trying to ID. And that person is called a candidate for identification, because we don't produce an exact ID, even though personally we've never actually been wrong. We've actually gotten within sibling groups every single case we've ever closed out. A candidate for identification then is passed off to law enforcement to confirm via conventional means, which is STR Codis comparison, one-to-one matching, dental records, fingerprints, or corroborating evidence from family members or people who knew the person, enough to let the coroner go back to the coroner again and let them know that you can issue a death certificate for this person, and this is the remains of this person. So a lot of people work together on this. We do the bulk of the investigative work with the historical records, And by working with the law enforcement agencies, we were able to corroborate that with things that they know about the circumstances of the case, which are non-public. So we work really closely together. We work under non-disclosure agreements so that all the information stays safe and secure. And it's really a team effort. And we really should be the closers. I'll say that again. We should be the closers in every case. Everything else should get tried first before it comes to us. And then we will do our absolute best to produce that candidate.
All right. Officer Turner, the next question to you, sir. And it's a question that I have been wondering about for some time. So let's have a go at it again. A viewer says, I saw two conflicting things online that have me puzzled. One was that Mary Jane Van Gilder withdrew her divorce petition, and the other said that it was dismissed when she never showed up for her court appearance. Can we figure this out?
Yeah, so initially I believed, and I think the family believed too, that she withdrew it. But, you know, when I actually looked into the files and started thinking about it, it was withdrawn, but she wasn't the one that withdrew it. It was probably withdrawn because they couldn't find her. Yeah, I think that the one date, the original date that she went missing, really that last date on her resignation from the Air Force Depot is the one that we've used.
Following up on that with the next question, I'll paraphrase it. Was Mary Jane's husband ever questioned?
No. There was, if he was, I know nothing about it, and no files have existed to document that. You know, if Mary Jane disappeared from Ohio, and what investigation the Marion County Sheriff did at that time, and he did do some, because there are documents in that FBI file that I obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, where I could see his letters. He did try and he did search, but I don't think he was ever questioned. The family doesn't recall any, you know, their dad being questioned. And obviously these are very old memories, but there's just nothing to substantiate that he was questioned at all.
Quite a few members of Mary Jane's family are still alive, are they not?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, her, you know, her, like I mentioned earlier, her eldest daughter, Anna Mae, has really been the fountainhead in all of this. And unfortunately, some of Mary Jane's children have passed away. Mindy and Misty's mother, Barbara, passed away. But the remaining of her kids and their descendants, you know, are still living. So even though 76 years have passed, and I said this before, the wounds of her absence are felt down through the generations. You know, people say, well, time heals all wounds. Well, it really doesn't. You know, it might lessen it a little bit, but when somebody's missing, you're left in this weird purgatory of just not knowing, and it's very difficult for people to carry, and it's a hole in that family tree that ties us back through time that is bothersome. And so yes, her family's still alive, her family's very active, and I'm just, you know, I'm happy that they reached out to us when they did.
Okay. Anthony, the next question is for you, sir. Concerning Penny Doe, if her body had not been involved, wouldn't that increase the odds of someone having killed her and buried her body somewhere close by?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
If Penny Doe's body was not, let me make sure that I read it correctly. If Penny Doe's body wasn't embalmed, wouldn't that increase the odds of someone having killed her and buried her body nearby?
Yes, somewhat. But the thing to recall here is that there are some religious groups and cultures that do not embalm their dead. So it would really depend on who she was and what her family decided for her. However, given, again, that we haven't found any evidence to suggest there was actually any burial sites, I believe that increases the odds in and of itself that she was a clandestine burial of someone who was murdered. But time will tell when we get closer to an ID. Some things will become clearer. We'll be able to get a better idea of who she was in life and where she was at the end of her life and who was around her, and try to make some inferences from that, and then toss it back to Adam to do the rest of the investigative process after we have a name. So all that being said, theoretically, you might think that if a person who was buried and then unearthed in a flood was not embalmed, they would be a clandestine burial. But the truth is that there are many people who are buried traditionally and legally who are not embalmed.
Understood. Following the exhumation, were any of the bones ever checked to see if there had been any unnatural fractures, breaks, possible injuries that could indicate foul play?
They were looked at by BCI, and I think they were quote unquote unremarkable. So there was nothing there. The skeleton was not complete. There was some bones that were missing. But even if it was a complete skeleton, oftentimes it's very difficult to determine if there was trauma to the body based on the bones alone, because obviously if you can be stabbed, you can be shot, and if those objects do not hit a bone, you are not going to see any indications of trauma to that bone. But as far as Penny, there was nothing, no clear knife wound or saw cut that was observed.
Prefacing this next question, one thing I don't think that we have touched on that I think is extremely important, in the days leading up to the discovery of Penny's remains, Ohio was inundated with very, very heavy rain. And if you saw the feature, you saw that a great deal of Ohio was actually underwater. So is it possible that her body had always been in that area and was only unearthed as a result of this heavy rain?
Yeah, I mean, sure, it's possible that it was she was buried very near to that drainage ditch where she was found, and that the rain and the erosion kind of brought her body to the surface. When you think about the dental, when you look and we talk about the dental plate, that does bring it to a specific period in time. So we're not saying that it's ancient Native American remains or Civil War remains or anything like that. It is in the 20th century. So yes, like I said, anything's possible. But I believe, and it's my opinion, and this is just my speculation, that yes, it was a clandestine grave buried somewhere along that flood path.
Anthony, I know that your team has been very hard at work on this, so I think this next question should go to you. Is it possible to find out where Penny Doe's skull went?
We are trying very hard to figure out where Penny's skull went. Our team has been contacting local universities in a tri-state area, honestly, to just basically reach out and say, hey, do you have any skulls around that you don't know where they came from? And if you happen to also have a bifurcated rib, that would be great too. So far, we have a couple of threads to pull at, and we're waiting to hear back from some others. And we are definitely taking the search for the skull very seriously, and documenting every step of the way who has been contacted and who hasn't, and who has replied and who hasn't. So we'll just keep trying. The likelihood that it is in the collection of a university is fairly high. The likelihood that it's in the collection of a family member in the back of a closet is also somewhat high, because the way that human remains are handled has changed a lot. And honestly, the laws surrounding who can own and transfer human remains have changed a lot and are still not entirely very clear. So, given experiences that I've had before on other cases that I've worked on, and given the stories that I've heard from my anthropologist friends, I can tell you that, yes, occasionally you do randomly find human remains and go, who left these human remains here, either in a university or in your house. So they could really be anywhere. And we are doing our best to make logical guesses of where to look and to reach out to those places and see if they have anything that matches the description.
Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, if you'll permit me, this next particular question, if you don't mind, I think I'm going to field it because it is not too difficult. And I quote, "You mean there was never a skull, ? At exhumation? Am I hearing this right? ? No, at the exhumation, there was no skull unearthed. It was not there. And that was immediately noticed and immediately commented upon without even missing a beat. And the theory at that time, again, was that it had ended up in a school or another academic institution of some kind. Would either of you care to correct me on that, or is that accurate?
No, that
is accurate.
That is
Alrighty.
accurate.
Okay. I understand that with the current operations that are underway, there is a fundraiser involved. Would either of you care to touch on that?
I'm more than happy to, unless Adam would like to talk about it first.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so in the process of identifying an unidentified decedent through forensic genetic genealogy, there are a number of different ways that the actual funding of the case can be handled. And one of them is through fundraising for the lab fees. This is not unusual, and that is because, as it is a very new science and new technique, there are not funds allocated to this in investigating agency budgets. In some instances, there might be funds available, but it might actually be, for whatever reason, a choice of the investigating agency to go through fundraising, because the way that funding happens for testing varies agency to agency, and the number of people who have to sign off on it can be many. In the case of Penny Doe, we decided to go the fundraising route because it was not something that there were funds allocated towards. And honestly, I personally think, as an educator as well, I think that giving the public an opportunity to contribute to the identification of a case will give them some sense of ownership and involvement in that, and also carry the message of that case further. Therefore, I think that fundraisers are an excellent way to handle forensic genetic genealogy cases, because in the process of those fundraisers, more people will hear about the case, more people will not only donate to the fees that are associated with it, but also maybe they'll take a DNA test and upload because they think, oh, hey, maybe I'm related to this person, and maybe when it gets through the lab process, my name will come up in the match list. I'm going to tell my friends in the area that if they haven't taken a DNA test, they should too, because publicity matters. buy-in matters. I mean, I don't like associating numbers with a need for human identification, but it's true. And people hold on to that. People hold on to that number and that value. And the more traction that gets, the better it will be for the case in a number of ways, more than just the need for funding the lab fees. Same with doing forensic art. Forensic art isn't just for the sake of identification, it's to gain traction, to get the word out that there is this case and we shouldn't forget about it. So that's my piece on it. And you can find the link on our website, or if you go to redgraveresearch.com/penny, it's right there, along with all the links to these live streams and a flyer that you can print out and share with people. If you're not able to donate to the fee, you can print them out, put them up wherever you want. And other people will find them and be able to help. So that's my part, and I'm going to pass it back over to Adam if you want to add anything about why we're choosing fundraising and why it's important.
So we, as an agency, as a city, we're a smaller city, a smaller agency, and to be quite honest, funds for law enforcement across this country are being stripped away from us and taken from us, and we're having to reduce our staff. We're having to cut our budget significantly, and there is, the fees to exhume are probably going to be the first thing that goes when it comes to budget reduction. Now, some larger cities, they might have the means to be able to allocate a certain amount of funds for exhumations or for cold cases, but smaller cities, medium-sized cities across this country are just not going to be able to afford it. And early on, I reached out to BCI and I said, "Hey, is there a state fund that could assist in exhumations?" And I was told, "No, there isn't. There should be. I think it's in the process, or it should be in the process, but we're not quite there yet."
Vicarious participation. It's a very strong motivator, indeed. Officer Turner, a very important question, and I think the meaning of just why it is important will strike you immediately here. A question from Mindy Wilson. Do you think you will, or we will ever solve Mary Jane's case?
Yes, I do. And I won't stop until we do. I like to think I'm relatively young, not as young as I used to be, but I still have a long career ahead of me, and I'm not going to stop until we have some answers. And I think we've made a lot of progress in the years, the 2 years that I've taken this case on. And I'm just glad that, I've got to know your family professionally and personally.
Have either of you spoken with the children who found Penny? And if so, what are their recollections?
I did. I reached out to Brian McFall. I think I mentioned this earlier. And he was a little surprised to have this random person call them about something that happened so long ago. But yeah, he remembered it. And he said it was quite a shock to see that. And that when they found it, he remembers running, frantically back to his house to tell his parents. And the way he described it, the way he described finding the body, and he still remembered it, that he said there wasn't a lot left, but there was a little bit of flesh that he could see on the bone, and that's what we know from the coroner's report.
All right, hold on just one second, gentlemen. I'm trying to check up with the questions that are coming across here rather quickly, and forgive me if I am reading on the air here. One of our viewers say, I don't know if we can do this or not, but some people would still like the divorce between Mary Jane and her husband amplified on. Are we able to do that?
Yeah. I mean, so Mary Jane moved up here. She was still married at the time to her husband, James. And she had filed for divorce in Huron County. And I'm sorry, I just cannot remember the date off the top of my head right now, but she did file for divorce in Huron County. And, then she had an attorney at the time. And, we initially thought that it was withdrawn or that she withdrew it, but I think, and there's surmising here that it was withdrawn by her attorney because they could not reach her. And we have some documents stating that, they mail was forwarded to her last known address, but it was returned. And Anna Mae's letters to her mother sent to the last known address were returned to her. So it is likely that if a letter was mailed from the court to that address, it also would have been returned. Now, James was still in West Virginia, and he also filed for divorce in Marion County, and it was granted.
Gentlemen, I believe we have come to the last question of the evening. And Anthony, it is for you, sir.
All right.
A viewer has noticed they find it interesting that I believe they mean Preble County, went through the trouble to bury her body, not knowing that they were going to donate or keep the skull. Why keep the rest?
That is not an uncommon practice. A lot of that is because of the use of the retaining of the skull usually has to do with forensic art and also making comparisons with photographs. Pardon? Yes, and odontology. So at the time, the forensic odontology was the big thing, and forensic imaging of an entire face is actually fairly new in comparison. That started in like the mid to late 80s, like late 70s to mid to late 80s. There's some evidence of that. So they might have retained her skull for the purpose of comparing to dental records if they found any. So they would have retained that to continue research on the case. There are many other instances that we can point to of Jane Does or John Does who have been buried without their head. All the just the postcranial remains buried, and the skull retained for potential identification purposes. Now, the reason why her remains were interred is because of storage space. To be completely honest, that's usually why remains are either interred or cremated, is because of storage space at the medical examiner's office. You can only hold so many unidentified remains, and if you have a lot of them, you have to put them somewhere. Now, I definitely prefer it when people inter bodies because then you can actually get them back if you need them. But there are many, many places in the country that will just cremate, but retain something, hopefully, so that they can use it for future identification purposes. So in this instance, not that terribly unusual, but also a bit of a monkey wrench that we don't know where the skull is.
A monkey wrench in a case that is already full of monkey wrenches,
yes.
Almost. Gentlemen, I know it does not really seem like it, but we have been here for nearly 2 hours, and it appears that we have now come to the end of the questions. So before we begin to sign off, is there anything that either of you would like to add in summation?
One thing that I was thinking, it is a common misconception across this country that when someone goes missing, you have to wait 48 hours, 72 hours before they're reported to local law enforcement. That is incorrect. Do not let anyone tell you that. They can be reported immediately. And it is from a law enforcement perspective. The sooner that we can get going on an investigation, the better. So come to us right away if your loved one is missing.
Anthony, any last coin to throw in the fountain?
I will absolutely concur with what Adam said, and I will add that if you are the family member of a missing person who has been missing for some time, please follow up. And go to GEDmatch. Upload your DNA to GEDmatch, because while there's excellent communication between the two counties that are involved in Penny's case, that's not always the case with other agencies. Sometimes case information is not shared across county or state lines. And if someone goes missing in one county and ends up in another one, they might not be compared right away. And so you'll want to follow up. You'll want to follow up with your local agency, and you'll want to get if you are a sibling, or if you're a full sibling, parent, or child of a missing person, get your DNA submitted to Codis. And if you are a half sibling or other relationship and there's no others available, get your DNA uploaded to GEDmatch. And that's really really good shot of getting family members ID right now. Also, yeah, and if you just want to help a case, please upload to GEDmatch and attach your tree when you do this too, because that makes our job a lot easier. There are thousands upon thousands of unidentified remains in this country, and the number is ever growing, and there's only so many people who are able to actually do this kind of research. And when all else fails and it comes to us, the more data we have to work with, the better, and the more unidentifieds we can get identified. If you want to learn how to help, please visit our website. There needs to be more of us. I won't be here forever. None of us who are doing this right now will be here forever, and there's a lot of work to do. Please look into possibly learning how to help, because there's so much to be done. And call out to other cold case homicide investigators. Look to Adam as an example. He's called on every single resource he has, and he's reached out in places that are typically not reached out to, because he cares. And all these people that we're looking to identify, they're people. We don't know who their names are, but they're all individuals with a story and with someone out there who loves them. And we're all going to work together to do everything we can for everyone. So that's my soapbox. I'm going to step down off of it now.
Just a final thought for me as well. Something that the public can do is, if you know of unknown remains in your city or community, and they are not listed on NamUs, that needs to be brought to law enforcement attention. In this particular case, how did I find Penny? Was because somebody went to their cemetery, went to Mount Hill Cemetery, and documented, took pictures of graves, and someone had saved that article from '68 and put it on there, and that caught my attention. And if you are retired, or maybe it's a hobby and you want to go to the local cemetery, you will find graves that are marked unknown. And a lot of times those people are not going to be in NamUs, and they may have been forgotten. So you can be the key to kind of revitalizing an investigation. You can search NamUs. It's free. Anybody can search it. Find a grave is free. So I would definitely recommend doing those things if you're interested in helping.
I can't think of a better way to close. You can be the key. Proactivity can make all the difference in the world. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us here this evening and offering your views and insight into this matter.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for moderating.
Yes, thanks, Sean. Appreciate it.
And again, thanks to all of you who have joined us this evening for this live, unique look into what I can only term a fascinating case. And that's the way it is. Thursday, March 25th, 2021. For Officer Adam Turner and Anthony Redgrave, this is Sean McCracken with MysteriousWV. Good night.